Good morning, everybody. So, finally getting back to doing the readings of The Idea of History by R.G. Collingwood. Sorry for the long delay. This is part 17, starting on page 160. I'm not doing music anymore for a bit, or poems, so I'm getting back to the OG stuff. We're starting from previously on page 59 from the previous sentence, so that way it doesn't kind of break the flow. All these exist as civilizations at the present day, but we can also detect what appear to be fossilized relics of societies now extinct. One such set of relics includes the Monophysite and Nestorian Christians in the East, together with the Jews and Pharisees, and another including such branches of Buddhism and the Jains of India. Differences and relations between these societies he calls ecumenical. Differences and relations within a single society, such as those between Athens and Sparta, or France and Germany, he regards as quite different in kind. These he calls parochial. The field of the historian's study offers him an infinite variety of tasks, but among these, the most important are concerned with discerning and distinguishing these entities called societies, and studying the relations between them. This study is pursued by the means of certain general concepts or categories. One of these categories is affiliation, and its correlative is apparentation. Affiliation and its correlative apparentation. Exemplified, for instance, in the relation between our own society and the Hellenic society from which it is historically derived. Some societies are, so to speak, Melchizedek societies, not affiliated to any other. Some have no others affiliated to them. Some are interrelated through affiliation to the same parent society, and so on. Thus, it is possible to arrange societies according to the concept of affiliation into various classes, exhibiting the concept in these various ways. Another category is that of civilization, as distinct from primitive society. Every society is either primitive or civilized. The vast majority are primitive. These are, in general, relatively small in geographical extent and population, relatively short-lived, and commonly meeting their end through violence, either at the hands of a civilized society or through destruction by another uncivilized one. Civilizations are rarer in number and individually larger in scale. But the important thing to bear in mind about them is that the unity which they form is not the unity of an individual, but of a class. There is no one thing, civilization, except in the sense of common character, civilizedness, belonging to many different civilizations. The unity of civilization is an illusion fostered by the peculiar way in which our own civilization has entangled all others in which our own civilization has entangled all others in the meshes of its own economic system. And it is once dispelled if instead of attending to the economic map of the world, we look at its cultural map. Another category is that of the interregnum, or time of troubles, the chaotic period between the decay of one society and the rise of an affiliated one, like the European Dark Ages between the death of Hellenism and the rise of Western Christendom. Another is that of the internal proletariat, the body of persons within a society which owes nothing to that society except its physical life, although it may very well become the dominant element in a society affiliated to it, e.g., the Christians towards the close of the Hellenic society. Another is that of the eternal proletariat, or the barbarian world surrounding a given society, which joins hands with the internal proletariat to break it up when its creative power is exhausted. Others are the universal state and the universal church, organizations concentrating in themselves the entire political and religious life respectively of the society of which they arise. By studying historical records in the light of these categories, we can detect many societies now extinct which have been civilized in their time: a Syriac, a Minoan, Sumeric, a Hittite, a Babylonic, an Andean, a Yucatec, a Mexic, a Mayan, and a Egyptic. This, the last long-lived of all, for it lasted from the 4th millennium BC to the 1st century AD. With this prolegomena, Toynbee gets to work on his main task, which is the comparative study of civilizations. His first chief question is how and why civilizations arise. His second, how and why they grow. His third, how and why they break down. Then he goes on, according to the general plan prefixed to his first volume, to study the nature of universal states and universal churches, heroic gauges, and contacts between civilizations in space and time. The whole work is to close with sections on the prospects of Western civilization and on the inspirations of historians. I begin discussing Toynbee's work by saying that it represented a restatement of historical positivism. What I meant was that the principles which constitute its individuality are principles derived from the methodology of natural sciences. These principles are based on the conception of external relations. The natural scientist finds himself confronted by separate, discrete facts which can be counted, or alternatively, he cuts up the phenomena that confronts him into such countable discrete facts. He then proceeds to determine the relation between them, these relations being always links connecting one fact with another external to it. A collection of facts thus linked together forms again a single fact whose relation to others of the same order are of the same external kind. If the scientist's methods are to work at all, first thing necessary is that clear lines should be drawn between one fact and another. There must be no overlapping. These are the principles on which Toynbee deals with history. The first thing he does is to cut up the field of historical study into a specifiable number of distinct sections, each called a society. Each society is wholly self-contained. It is for Toynbee a very important question whether Western Christendom is a continuation of Hellenic society or a different society related to it by affiliation. The right answer, according to him, is the second. Anyone who gives the first, or who blurs the absolute distinction between the two answers, has committed the unpardonable offense against the first canon of historical method as he conceives it. We are not allowed to say that Hellenic civilization has turned into Western Christendom by a process of development involving the accentuation of some of its elements, the fading away of others, and the emergence of certain new elements within itself, and the borrowing of others from external sources. The philosophical principle involved in saying that would be the principle, I'm going to say that again. The philosophical principle involved in saying that would be the principle that a civilization may develop into new forms while yet remaining itself. Whereas Toynbee's principle is that of a civilization, if a civilization changes, it ceases to be itself and a new civilization comes into being. And this dilemma, as regarded development in time, holds good equally with regard to contacts in space. Such contacts are external contacts between one society and another. They therefore presuppose a clean cut between one society and its neighbors. We must be able to say exactly where one society leaves off and the other begins. We are not allowed to say that one shades off into the next. This is the positivistic conception of individuality, the conception according to which the individual is constituted as such by being cut off from everything else by a sharp boundary, distinguishing clearly what within it from what is outside. The inner and outer are mutually exclusive. This is the kind of individuality which is possessed by a stone or any other material body. It is the primary characteristic of the world of nature, and distinguishes that world from the world of mind, where individuality consists not of separateness from environment, but of the power to absorb environment into itself. It is therefore not what individuality means in history, so far as the world of history is a world of mind. The historian who studies a civilization other than his own can apprehend the mental life of that civilization only by reenacting its experience for himself. If the Western European of today studies Hellenic civilization historically, he enters into possession of the mental wealth of that civilization and makes it an integral part of his own. As a matter of fact, Western civilization has formed itself by doing exactly this, by reconstructing within its own mind the mind of the Hellenic world and developing the wealth of that mind in new directions. Thus, Western civilization is not related to Hellenic in any merely external way. The relation is an internal one. Western civilization expresses, and indeed achieves, its individuality not by distinguishing itself from Hellenic civilization, but by identifying itself therewith. Toynbee has failed to see this because his general conception of history is ultimately naturalistic. He regards the life of a society as a natural and not a mental life, something at the bottom merely biological and best understood on biological analogies. And this is connected with the fact that he never reaches the conception of historical knowledge as a reenactment of the past in the historian's mind. He regards history as mere spectacle, something consisting of facts observed and recorded by the historian, phenomena presented externally to his gaze, not experiences into which he must enter and which he must make his own. This is merely the way of saying that he has not undertaken any philosophical analysis of the way in which his historical knowledge has been attained. He possesses enormous quantities of it, but he treats it as if it were something he finds ready-made in books, and the problem that interests him is only the problem of arranging it when collected. His whole scheme is really a scheme of pigeonholes, elaborately arranged and labeled, into which ready-made historical facts can be put. Such schemes are not in themselves vicious, but they always entail certain dangers, notably the dangers of forgetting that the facts thus pigeonholed have to be separated from their context by an act of dissection. This act becomes habitual, leads to an obsession. One forgets that the historical fact, as it actually exists and as the historian actually knows it, is always a process in which something is changing into something else. This element of process is the life of history. In order to pigeonhole historical facts, the living body of history must be first killed. That is, its essential character as process must be denied, so that it may be dissected. The criticism which must be passed on Toynbee's principles is thus twofold. First, he regards history itself, historical process, as cut up by sharp lines into mutually exclusive parts, and denies the continuity of the process in virtue of which every part overlaps and interpolates others. His distinction between societies or civilizations is really a distinction between focal points in the process. He has misunderstood it as a distinction between chunks or lumps of facts into which the process is divided. Secondly, he misconceives the relation between the historical process and the historian who knows it. He regards the historian as the intelligent spectator of history, in the same way in which the scientist is the intelligent spectator of nature. He fails to see that the historian is an integral element in the process of history itself, reviving in himself the experiences of which he achieves historical knowledge. Just as the various parts of the process are misconceived as placed outside one another, so the process as a whole and the historian are placed outside one another. These two criticisms come in the last resort to the same thing, namely that history is converted into nature and the past, instead of living in the present. As it does in history, is conceived as a dead past as in nature. But at the same time, I must add that this criticism only affects fundamental principles. And in the detail of his work, Toynbee shows a very fine historical sense and only rarely allows his actual historical judgments to be falsified by the errors of his principles. One place where this does happen is in his judgment of the Roman Empire, which he regards as a mere phase in the decline of Hellenism. That is to say, because its relation to Greece is too close to permit of its being regarded as a distinct civilization, and because it is the only condition on which he would allow a genuine achievement of its own, his dilemma forces him to ignore all that it did to achieve and to treat it as mere phenomenon of decay. But in history, as it actually happens, there are no mere phenomena of decay. Every decline is also a rise. And it is only the historian's personal failure of knowledge or sympathy, partly due to mere ignorance, partly due to preoccupations of his practical life, that prevent him from seeing this double character at once creative and destructive of any historical process whatsoever. Section 2. Germany. In Germany, the home of the historical criticism, In Germany, the home of historical criticism, a great deal of interest was taken towards the end of the 19th century and increasingly after that. In theory of history, and in particular the nature of the distinction between it and science, messed that up a way of saying it. Let me say it again. Sorry, it's been a while since I've done live readings. In Germany, the home of historical criticism, a great deal of interest was taken towards the end of the 19th century, and increasingly after that. In the theory of history, and in particular, the nature of the distinction between it and science. Among the heirlooms which Germany inherited from her great philosophical period, the age of Kant and Hegel, was the idea that history and nature were in some sense two distinct worlds, each with its own character. Philosophers of the 19th century used to repeat the distinction as a commonplace, which passed from hand to mouth so often that its significance was worn quite flat in the process. Lotze, for example, in his Microcosmos, published in 1856, asserted that nature is the realm of necessity and history is the realm of freedom, an echo of post-Kantian idealism, which, in Lotze, means nothing definite, as the vague and empty chapters on history that work prove all too clearly. Lotze inherited from the German idealists, and in particular from Kant, the idea that man has a dual nature. A physiologist by early training, he insisted that man's body is nothing but a bundle of mechanisms. But at the same time, he held that a man's mind is free. Thus, as a body inhabits the world of nature, but as a mind he inhabits the world of history. But instead of working out the relation between these two things, as the great idealists had done, Lotze left the whole question in the air and never attempted to think it out at all. His work is characteristic of the woolly and emotional nebulosities which in Germany followed the collapse of the idealist school. Other German writers use other formulae for characterizing the terms of the same familiar antithesis. In his Grundrisse der Historique, I'm saying that with a French accent, I think, Jena, 1858, the distinguished historian Droysen defined nature as the coexistence of being. Das Nebeneinander des Seienden. I don't know how to pronounce anything in German. And history as the succession of becoming. A merely rhetorical antithesis which owed any plausibility it might possess to overlooking the fact that the world of nature, too, there are events and processes which follow one another in determinate order, and that in history there are things which coexist, like liberalism and capitalism, and whose coexistence is a problem for historical thought. The triviality of such formula show that the people were merely presupposing the distinction between nature and history, not trying to understand it. The first genuine attempt to understand it came with the advent of the Neo-Kantian school late in the century. It followed from the general principles of this school that to understand the difference between nature and history, one must approach the distinction from the subjective side. That is, one must distinguish the ways in which the scientist and the historian do their thinking. It was from this point that the view that Windelband, the eminent historian of philosophy, approached the subject in a rectorial address delivered in Strasbourg in 1894, which at once he became famous. Here he laid it down that history and science were two different things, each with its own method. Science, he explained, had as its purpose the formulation of general laws. History, the description of individual facts. The distinction he pompously baptized by saying that there were two kinds of science: nomothetic science, which is science in the common sense of the word, and ideographic science, which is history. This distinction between science as knowledge of the universal and history as knowledge of the individual was in itself of very small value. It was not even accurate as a statement of the prima facie difference. For the judgment, this is a case of typhoid fever, is not history but science. Although it is a description of individual fact, and the statement, all Roman silver of the 3rd century is debased, is not science but history, although it is a generalization. Of course, there is a sense in which Windelband's distinction can be defended against this criticism. The generalization about 3rd century coinage is really a statement about an individual fact, namely the monetary policy of the late Roman Empire. And the diagnosis of this disease as typhoid is not so much an individual judgment as the assumption of certain fact under a general formula, namely the definition of typhoid. The business of the scientist, as such, is not to diagnose typhoid in a particular case, though in subsidiary way it is his business too, but to define it in its general nature. The business of the historian, as such, is to explore the individual features of individual historical events, not to construct generalizations, though that too is a thing that enters into his work as a secondary feature. But when this is said, it is admitted that the formulation of laws and the description of individuals are not two mutually exclusive forms of thought, between which the whole field of reality can be divided by amicable agreement, as Windelband thinks. All that Windelband is really doing in his discussion of the relation between science and history is to put forward a claim on the part of historians who do their own work in their own way and let them be alone. I said that wrong. Do their own work in their own way and be let alone. It represents a kind of secessionist movement of historians from the general body of a civilization enthralled to natural science. But what this work is, and what is the way in which it can or should be done, Windelband cannot tell us, nor is he conscious of its inability. When he speaks of an ideographic science, he is implying that there can be a scientific, i.e., rational or non-empirical, knowledge of the individual. But strange as it may seem into son of a bitch. But strange as it may seem in so learned an historian of thought, he does not realize that the whole tradition of European philosophy from the early Greeks to his own day had declared with one voice that this knowledge is an impossibility. The individual, as a fleeting transient existence, can only be perceived or experienced as it occurs, and can never be the object of a stable and logically constructed thing, which is called scientific knowledge. The point had been very clearly made by Schopenhauer. And he quotes him right here. History lacks the fundamental characteristics of science, namely the subordination of objects of consciousness. All it can do is to present a simple coordination of the facts it has registered. Hence, there is no system in history as there is in other sciences. The sciences, being systems of cognition, always speak of kinds. History always of individuals. History, therefore, would be a science of individuals, which implies a self-contradiction." End quote. To this self-contradiction, Windelband shows himself strangely blind, especially in such passages as that in which he congratulates his modern countrymen on replacing the old-fashioned word history by the new and better one, it's two German words, science of nature. The only change really introduced by this word lies in the fact of its verbal similarity to the name of a natural science. That is to say, the sole reason for adopting it is that it enables people to forget how deep the difference is between history and natural science, and to slur over the distinction in positivistic manner, by assimilating history to the general pattern of science. So far as Windelband has dealt at all with the question of how there can be a science of the individual, he has answered it by saying that the historian's knowledge of historical events consists of judgments of value, that is, pronouncements on the spiritual worth of the actions which he is investigating. Thus, the historian's thought is ethical thought, and the history is a branch of morals. But to this answer, the question, now history, let me say that again. But this is to answer the question how history can be a science, by saying that it is not a science. In his introduction to philosophy, Windelband divides the whole subject matter into two parts, the theory of knowledge and the theory of value, and history falls in this second part. Thus, history ends by being extruded from one sphere of knowledge altogether, and we are left with the conclusion that what the historian does with the individual is not to know or think it, but somehow to intuit its value, an activity on the whole akin to that of the artist. But once more, the relation between history and art is not systematically thought out. Part 2, or Section 2. Rickert. Closely connected with Windelband's thought, but much more systematic, is that of Rickert, whose first work on this subject was published in Freiburg in 1896. Rickert maintains, in effect, that Windelband was really stating two distinctions between science and history instead of one. The first is the distinction between generalizing and individualizing thought. The second is the distinction between valuing and non-valuing thought. Combining these two, he gets 4 types of sciences. 1. Non-valuing and generalizing, or pure natural science. 2. Non-valuing and individualizing, or the quasi-historical sciences of nature like geology, evolutionary biology, etc. 3. Valuing and generalizing, or the quasi-scientific sciences of history like sociology, economics, theoretical jurisprudence, and so forth. 4. Valuing and individualizing, or history proper. Further, he sees that Windelband's attempt to divide reality into 2 mutually exclusive spheres of nature and history cannot be defended. Nature, as it really exists, does not consist of laws. It consists of individual facts, just like history. Consequently, Rickert arrives at the formula that reality as a whole is really history. Natural science is a network of generalizations and formulae built up by the human intellect. In the last resort, an arbitrary intellectual construction, not corresponding to any reality. This idea expressed in the title of the book, I am not going to try to read that. That's way too long and way too German for me. The limits of the formulation of the scientific concepts. Thus, his 4 kinds of sciences together form a scale having at one end the extreme case of arbitrary and abstract thought, a mere manipulation of artificial concepts, and at the other, the extreme case of concrete and genuine knowledge, the knowledge of reality in its individual existence. At first sight, this seems a conclusive counterattack on positivism. Natural science, from being held up as the one and only type of genuine knowledge, has been degraded to the position of an arbitrary play of abstractions, constructed in the air and achieving its perfection just so far as it leaves out the actual truth of concrete fact. History is regarded not only as a possible and legitimate form of knowledge, but as the only genuine knowledge that exists or can exist. But this revanche is not only fails in doing justice to natural science, it misunderstands history. Rickert regards nature, after the positivistic manner, as cut up into separate facts, and he goes on to deform history by regarding it in a similar way as an assemblage of individual facts supposed to differ from the facts of nature, only in being vehicles of value. The essence of history lies not in its consisting of individual facts, however valuable facts may be, but in the process or development leading from one to another. Rickert fails to see that the peculiarity of historical thought is the way in which the historian's mind, as the mind of the present day, apprehends the process by which the mind itself has come into existence through the mental development of the past. He fails to see what gives value to the past facts is the fact that they are not mere past facts. They are not a dead past, but a living past, a heritage of past thoughts, which, by the work of his historical consciousness, the historian makes his own. The past, cut off from the present, converted into mere spectacle, can have no value at all. It is history converted into nature. Thus, in the long run, positivism has its revenge on Rickert. Historical facts become mere disjointed occurrences, and as such can stand to each other only in the same kind of external relations of time and space, contiguity, resemblance, and causation as the facts of nature. And that brings us up to page 170. R.G. Collingwood's The Idea of History. Really good book. I have to get back into getting to the reading mode, though. I feel like I'm messing up a lot. But once I start practicing again, we'll get better. I like what Marty McFly said on the chat. Peace out, Chinmay. What's up, JoJo? Yeah, I'm not playing guitar anymore. I'm going to be releasing music at some point soon, so I'm no longer doing the whole practice spiel like I used to. Besides the fact I'm getting too many copyright claims, and I don't want to have to deal with that anymore. Yeah. But yeah, I'm not going to be doing any music for a bit, or poetry, or probably all you're going to see me do for a little bit is live readings and art. And if you're listening to this as an audiobook, skip to the next video. Yeah. So I'm not going to be doing that for a while. All I'm going to be doing is making my paintings. And if I'm gonna do guitar work, it's only gonna be in the shorts form. This is another good one that I like that I did a few days ago. Did that on a live stream. That's the other one that I have that I did recently. Yeah, I've been having a lot of fun doing these. But I need to get more canvases and get more supplies. That way I can make more art. But yeah, I'm getting back into that. Music was fun. I'm tired of playing other people's music though, so I'm not going to do that anymore. I might do covers, like full covers. If I'm going to do that, they're going to be really good. It's not going to be me fumbling around on live anymore. But appreciate y'all that liked it while it lasted. And I will see y'all tomorrow for another reading.